The quiet cul-de-sac of Willow Creek prided itself on its polished image. Every lawn trimmed, every flowerbed weeded, every driveway aligned like puzzle pieces in a glossy brochure. But beneath the neat exterior, the Homeowners Association worked like a machine, grinding down anything or anyone that didn't fit their rigid standard. And for Robert Jenkins, a man who had lived in the neighborhood for nearly a decade, that machine was about to roll straight across his life. Robert was a middle-aged contractor, known for his weathered hands and easygoing nature. His house, though modest, was always tidy. His driveway, though cracked in places, served him well enough for his truck and the small trailer he used for weekend projects. For years, he'd kept to himself, paying dues on time, waving politely to neighbors, and staying clear of HOA drama. But in late spring, everything changed. Without warning, the HOA announced a curb expansion project, one meant to improve uniformity and accessibility along the neighborhood streets. At first glance, it seemed harmless, even beneficial. But when Robert returned home one Friday evening, he discovered the expansion had claimed more than just uniformity. It had swallowed his driveway. The new curb jutted several feet farther than before, slicing across the front of his property and boxing him in like a concrete prison. His truck no longer fit comfortably, his trailer couldn't maneuver, and worse yet, the space left behind meant he couldn't back out without risking damage. He was trapped. His own driveway had become a cage. Frustration grew quickly. Robert contacted the HOA, expecting a simple correction. But the board's response was blunt and unapologetic. The curb met community guidelines. Adjustments, they said, would compromise the neighborhood's uniform appearance. To them, his inconvenience was irrelevant. To Robert, it was an insult. At first, he tried patience. He parked farther down the street, dragging groceries up the hill, weaving around the very curb that had stolen his access. But every time he struggled, he thought of the dismissive tone of the board's letters, the way they waved off his concerns like they were nothing. Each step past the curb scraped against his pride, until what began as irritation burned into indignation. And as the weeks passed, Robert noticed something else. Neighbors whispered about the curb, not with sympathy, but with curiosity. Cars slowed, drivers staring at the awkward blockade, murmuring about poor planning and HOA nonsense. It became a small spectacle, an ugly blemish on the HOA's picture-perfect street. Robert realized something important. If the HOA could use his driveway to make a statement about power, then he could use it to make a statement of his own. He would not remain boxed in. He would turn his trap into a stage. The idea struck him late one Saturday night. He sat on his porch, sipping coffee, staring at the harsh lines of the curb under the glow of a street lamp. The thought came sharp and fast. If the HOA wanted to block his driveway, fine. He'd make it impossible to ignore. He'd give them a spectacle they couldn't sweep away. By Sunday morning, he began his quiet rebellion. A folding table appeared at the edge of his driveway, draped with a cloth, stacked with handmade birdhouses and planters he had crafted from leftover wood. A small handwritten sign leaned against the curb, "Pop-up Market, Support Local Craft." At first, neighbors chuckled. Some stopped by out of curiosity, buying a birdhouse or planter for a few dollars. Children lingered, fascinated by the little stand. Robert smiled politely, his hands busy arranging goods. The curb, once a symbol of his entrapment, had become a platform. But he didn't stop there. The following weekend, more tables appeared. A cooler filled with sodas. A tray of cookies baked by a neighbor's daughter. Another friend dropped off jars of homemade jam. Within 2 weeks, Robert's block driveway had transformed into a vibrant pop-up market. What began as a protest had grown into a community event. Cars now stopped regularly, visitors browsing goods, chatting and laughing, right under the HOA's watchful eye. The curb that once silenced him now amplified his voice. The HOA's attempt at control had backfired spectacularly. The very expansion meant to enforce uniformity had created chaos. The kind of chaos that drew attention, cameras, and curiosity from beyond the neighborhood. By the third week, photos of Robert's market appeared on social media. Locals outside Willow Creek drove in just to see the spectacle of a man who turned his block driveway into a weekly fair. The HOA, once invisible, was now under an uncomfortable spotlight. Their decision, once hidden in the language of guidelines, was now exposed in public view. And Robert, for the first time in weeks, felt something he thought the curb had stolen: control. His market wasn't just about crafts or cookies. It was about visibility. It was about proving that no amount of concrete could bury his voice. But as the market grew, so did the HOA's anger. What began as a simple curb project had spiraled into a full-blown standoff, one that would test how far each side was willing to go. The street had become a battleground, the driveway a stage, and the HOA's reputation a casualty waiting to fall. The question now wasn't whether Robert could outlast the HOA. It was whether the HOA could withstand the storm they had unleashed. And this was only the beginning. The first days of Robert's pop-up market felt like an experiment, something small, something he expected the HOA to swat down quickly. But instead, the opposite happened. What began as one folding table of birdhouses turned into a weekly gathering. Every Saturday morning, neighbors emerged with their own small contributions, eager to support the quiet rebellion. The curb that had once trapped him became a magnet. Children sold lemonade in plastic cups. Teenagers displayed homemade bracelets. Retirees brought jars of pickles, honey, or hand-knitted scarves. The driveway transformed into a patchwork of color, noise, and commerce, the kind of energy Willow Creek had never seen. The crowd was modest at first, 10, maybe 15 people wandering through. But word traveled fast. A mother from a nearby neighborhood posted a cheerful photo on social media. Blocked by HOA? Turn it into a blessing. The picture of Robert's birdhouses lined neatly across the blocked driveway spread further than anyone expected. Likes and comments poured in, and soon enough, cars that didn't belong to Willow Creek began rolling through. By the third Saturday, the pop-up market drew nearly 50 people. Families parked along the cul-de-sac, spilling onto sidewalks, weaving through the small but lively stalls. The sound of chatter filled the air, laughter echoing against the very concrete curb meant to silence Robert. Robert noticed something else. Neighbors who had always kept to themselves suddenly found common ground. The market wasn't just about buying and selling. It became a space where people gathered, shared stories, swapped recipes, or lingered to gossip about the HOA's latest overreach. The once sterile street began to feel alive, humming with the warmth of community. But while Robert felt a renewed sense of purpose, the HOA board saw something else entirely. To them, the market was chaos. The uniformity they had prided themselves on was unraveling. Cars lined the street unevenly, trash bins overflowed with cups and wrappers, children ran freely without the restraint of clipped lawns or silent sidewalks. It was a direct violation of everything the HOA believed they controlled. Board members began making appearances. At first, they came quietly, mingling among the crowd, frowning at the tables, scribbling notes onto clipboards. Robert saw them, but he didn't flinch. He arranged more birdhouses, stacked more planters, and greeted strangers with the same friendly nod. If the HOA wanted confrontation, they would have to make the first move. By mid-June, the market had grown into something no one could ignore. Local bloggers began covering it, curious about the story of a driveway blocked by a curb turned into a public protest. Headlines read, HOA meets its match in pop-up market, and the driveway that sparked a neighborhood revolution. Each article drew more visitors. Each visitor left with a story of their own. The HOA scrambled. Their newsletters carried stern warnings about unauthorized commercial activity, citing obscure bylaws and vague threats of fines. But the more they pushed, the more people came. Residents who had never cared much about rules now actively resisted them, emboldened by Robert's stand. Every warning letter became fuel, proof that the HOA's control was cracking. One Saturday afternoon, Robert stood at the edge of his driveway, watching the crowd swell. A group of teenagers played guitar near the sidewalk. Two mothers traded baked goods for cash. A retired veteran told stories to children gathered at his feet. The once quiet street buzzed like a fairground, and Robert realized the market had grown far beyond his own rebellion. It had become a symbol. The driveway wasn't just his anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever felt suffocated by the HOA's rules. Every jar of jam, every trinket, every laugh in defiance was a tiny declaration. The HOA could not own their spirit. But symbols carried weight, and weight carried consequences. As dusk fell, Robert noticed something ominous. At the far end of the cul-de-sac, a black SUV idled, its headlights off, its engine humming low. He knew that car. It belonged to Gerald Morton, the HOA president. Gerald didn't step out. He didn't need to. His silent presence was a message, one Robert understood immediately. The board had tolerated the spectacle long enough. The time for notes and newsletters was ending. The curb, once a physical blockade, had now grown into a battle line. And while Robert had won the first round by drawing the crowd, he knew the HOA wasn't finished. They would escalate. They always did. The question was how and when. The night closed in with the soft murmur of voices fading, tables packed away, cars dispersing into the dark. Robert stood on his porch, looking at the curb, lit faintly by the streetlight. The market had grown beyond his imagination, but so had the stakes. The HOA would not allow this rebellion to continue unchecked. For now, the crowd had gathered in his favor. But battles fought in daylight often gave way to darker games at night. And Robert could feel the storm gathering. The following week arrived with an eerie silence. No newsletter, no warnings slipped under doors, no sternly worded emails cluttering inboxes. For the first time in weeks, the HOA seemed to retreat, and the absence of their usual chatter felt unnatural. Robert had lived under their watch long enough to know silence wasn't peace, it was plotting. The pop-up market carried on, buzzing with neighbors and visitors, the curb still serving as the ironic stage for rebellion. Children sold crafts, teenagers blasted music from portable speakers, and the energy of community thrived. But beneath the laughter, Robert felt tension like a faint wire stretched too tight, humming under pressure. Every glance toward the end of the street, where Gerald's black SUV had idled before, reminded him that the board president was waiting, watching. The strike came on a Monday morning. Robert woke to the sound of heavy machinery rumbling outside. At first, he thought it was road work, maybe a utility crew fixing pipes. But as he pulled back the curtain, his stomach dropped. A small construction team, hired by the HOA, was tearing into the ground near the curb. Bright orange cones marked the site, and a portable sign announced, "Drainage and Safety Improvements, authorized by Willow Creek HOA." To anyone else, it looked like routine maintenance. But Robert saw the truth. The board was striking directly at the driveway. With every scoop of gravel, the crew made the curb more permanent, the blockage deeper, the trap more suffocating. By noon, the construction had reshaped the lane into something unrecognizable. The once level surface now sloped unevenly, channeling water directly toward his property. The curb was no longer just an obstacle, it had become a weapon. Rain would pool, mud would collect, and the blocked driveway would soon be a swamp. Neighbors gathered in disbelief. Some muttered about permits. Others whispered about abuse of power. But Gerald arrived with a folder of neatly printed documents, his smug smile visible from the sidewalk. The paperwork, stamped and sealed, claimed everything was in order. Drainage improvements, he called it, though the intent was obvious to anyone with eyes. The HOA had made its move. That night, Robert sat at his kitchen table, the paperwork spread before him, lit by the dim glow of a single lamp. The market had been a joyful rebellion, but the stakes were no longer symbolic. The board wasn't just annoyed, they were retaliating. They were willing to dig into the ground, spend money, and twist regulations just to crush his stand. Robert could have stopped there. He could have packed away the birdhouses, folded the tables, and retreated into quiet compliance. But the thought filled him with something close to rage. He remembered the faces of the children selling lemonade, the retired veteran telling stories, the mothers trading pies, the teenagers strumming guitars. He remembered their smiles, their laughter, their freedom, things the HOA could never manufacture with paperwork or bylaws. If the board wanted escalation, they would get it. But Robert wouldn't fight them with letters or lawsuits. He would fight them with creativity, the one thing they could never control. The next Saturday, the market reopened, but this time, Robert added a new twist. He marked the edge of the curb with chalk outlines, mimicking police markers at a crime scene. Bright yellow caution tape crisscrossed the driveway, fluttering in the wind, announcing the market as a spectacle rather than a nuisance. The curb wasn't just a blockade anymore. It was evidence. Evidence of the HOA's overreach, turned into theater. Visitors loved it. They took pictures of the crime scene market and shared them online. Within hours, the images spread across social media. Hashtags sprouted. Hashtag driveway drama, hashtag curbside crime, hashtag ekifel. The story that had once been local now reached audiences far beyond Willow Creek. What the HOA had intended as a crushing blow became Robert's loudest victory. The market doubled in size, drawing not just neighbors but reporters, vloggers, and curious passers-by. Cars filled every available space, and the cul-de-sac pulsed with life. But the victory came with consequences. The board was livid. Gerald stormed into the next market, flanked by 2 other board members, waving violation notices in the air. He barked about fines, threatened legal action, warned of police intervention. But Robert stood calm, surrounded by neighbors who weren't just customers anymore. They were witnesses, allies, and defenders. Every threat Gerald shouted only seemed to strengthen the crowd's resolve. Mothers crossed their arms, retirees shook their heads, teenagers rolled their eyes. The board looked less like enforcers and more like intruders crashing a celebration. Robert knew, however, that the board wasn't finished. Gerald's fury wasn't about birdhouses or lemonade stands, it was about control. And men like Gerald didn't back down because of laughter or hashtags. They doubled down. That evening, as Robert closed up the tables and pulled down the caution tape, he glanced at the curb. The chalk outlines had faded in the sun, the tape sagged in the breeze, but the message lingered. The HOA had struck hard, but their weapon had backfired. Still, Robert could sense something darker building beneath the surface. The board had been humiliated, mocked not just in the neighborhood but across the internet. And humiliation had a way of sharpening grudges. The storm wasn't over. It was only gathering strength. And Robert knew the next strike would come not with shovels or construction crews, but with something sharper, something designed to wound where laughter couldn't reach. The days following the crime scene market were filled with an odd kind of tension. On the surface, life in Willow Creek carried on as usual. Mail trucks hummed past, sprinklers hissed across lawns, children rode bicycles down the sidewalks. But beneath that normalcy, everyone knew a line had been crossed. The HOA was not just irritated anymore, it was embarrassed. And embarrassment was dangerous, because it turned petty rule keepers into relentless crusaders. The market continued to flourish. Each weekend brought more visitors, more tables, and more attention. Local food trucks began parking nearby, drawn by the growing crowds. A farmer from a nearby county set up a stall to sell fresh produce, turning the neighborhood cul-de-sac into something resembling a small-town fairground. What had started as Robert's protest against a blocked driveway had evolved into something much larger, a statement about freedom, community, and defiance. Yet even as the crowd swelled, Robert noticed cracks forming in the atmosphere. Some neighbors whispered about the HOA's next move, worrying that lawsuits or police involvement might shut everything down. A handful of residents, loyal to Gerald and the board, began spreading rumors that Robert's market was lowering property values and attracting undesirable attention. The neighborhood that once seemed united now hovered on the edge of division, pulled between those who loved the freedom of the pop-up market and those who feared the wrath of the HOA. The board's retaliation came in a new form. Letters began arriving in Robert's mailbox almost daily, each one stamped with the HOA's seal. They cited noise violations, parking infractions, unauthorized gatherings, and safety concerns. The language was cold, technical, and suffocating. Every word was designed to grind him down, to remind him that no matter how many people cheered at his market, the board held the paperwork, the bylaws, and the fines. Robert ignored the letters at first, tossing them into a growing stack on his kitchen counter. But as the pile grew thicker, so did the threats. The HOA wasn't satisfied with warnings, they wanted to break him. The letters began to mention escalating fines, liens against his property, and legal proceedings. Each envelope felt heavier than the last, as if carrying the weight of the board's obsession. Meanwhile, Gerald's presence grew bolder. He began walking past the market more frequently, his expression sour and stiff, clipboard tucked under his arm like a weapon. Sometimes he stopped to scribble notes, sometimes to snap photographs, always radiating disdain. His black SUV became a familiar shadow, idling at the curb just far enough away to seem lawful, yet close enough to feel threatening. Robert, however, refused to bend. Instead, he leaned deeper into his creativity. If the board wanted to call his driveway a violation, he would make it a spectacle. He added more chalk outlines, staged exaggerated evidence markers, and even borrowed a mannequin from a friend to place dramatically near the curb as part of the crime scene display. Visitors loved it. Photos of the mannequin sprawled across the blocked driveway went viral online, fueling the narrative that the HOA had become a national joke. But for every laugh shared on social media, Robert felt the stakes rising higher. The market was no longer just a neighborhood quirk, it had become a symbol. And symbols attract conflict. One evening, as twilight settled over Willow Creek, Robert found his mailbox pried open, the latest HOA letter left torn and scattered across his lawn. The violation notice fluttered in the grass like a warning flag, its edges damp from dew. For the first time, Robert felt a chill that wasn't from the night air. This wasn't just a bureaucratic battle anymore, it was personal. Someone wanted him rattled. Someone wanted him afraid. The next morning, the board escalated again. This time, it wasn't a letter, it was an official notice of a lien filed against his property. The fine, compounded from weeks of violations, had reached an outrageous sum. The message was clear: comply or risk losing everything. News of the lien spread quickly. Some neighbors gasped in horror, rallying around Robert with even more determination to keep the market alive. Others grew wary, fearing that siding with him would drag them into financial or legal jeopardy. The neighborhood's unity fractured further, and Robert could feel the isolation creeping in. Still, he refused to give up. The market opened the following Saturday as always, the crime scene theme now brighter, louder, and more defiant than ever. Crowds poured in, children laughed, and neighbors traded goods as if the HOA's threats were nothing more than background noise. Yet in the back of Robert's mind, a gnawing unease took root. He had won battles before, but this was starting to feel like a war without end. That evening, as the last visitors left and silence returned to the cul-de-sac, Robert sat on his porch staring at the curb. The chalk lines had smudged, the mannequin leaned awkwardly, and the caution tape sagged. He felt the fatigue of weeks of resistance pressing down on him. The HOA was relentless, the board vindictive, and Gerald's shadow ever-present. For the first time since the market began, Robert wondered if he had reached his limit. He had fought, laughed, resisted, and inspired, but at what cost? His savings were thinning under the threat of fines, his nights restless with worry, and his property now marked with a lien. The market was a victory for the community, but for Robert, it was beginning to feel like a burden that might crush him. As he stood to gather the last scraps of tape from the driveway, a neighbor approached quietly, offering a small basket of baked goods as a gesture of support. Robert accepted it with a tired smile. It reminded him that he wasn't truly alone, even if the fight was wearing him down. Still, the air around Willow Creek felt heavier than ever. The HOA had shown it would stop at nothing, and Robert knew the breaking point was close. The question was whether it would break the board or break him. The lien against Robert's home marked a turning point. What had once been a neighborhood spectacle was now a full-blown war. The HOA board had escalated the fight into financial and legal territory, signaling that they were willing to destroy a homeowner rather than admit defeat. For Robert, every step forward in his driveway market was now shadowed by the weight of uncertainty. He had turned a blocked driveway into a statement of freedom, but the price of defiance was climbing higher with every passing day. The board, led by Gerald, intensified its campaign. Weekly notices became daily. Inspectors appeared unannounced, walking the street with cameras, documenting every corner of Robert's property. They cited the height of his hedges, the angle of his trash bins, even the length of his grass. Each detail, no matter how minor, was weaponized into a violation. It was not about maintaining standards anymore. It was about breaking a man who had made the board look foolish. The market itself had grown into something beyond Robert's imagination. Local artisans set up regular stalls, food trucks treated Saturdays like a scheduled route, and small businesses saw the cul-de-sac as free advertising. Even residents from nearby neighborhoods arrived to witness the infamous crime scene market. What the board considered a nuisance had blossomed into a movement. But with each weekend came heightened tension. Police cruisers began appearing, sometimes slowly circling the block, sometimes parking briefly before driving off. The officers were polite, but their presence carried weight. It was clear they had been called by the HOA, pressured to investigate alleged disturbances. Yet each time they found nothing more than neighbors enjoying food, crafts, and conversation. Still, the image of patrol cars among food stands added to the spectacle, making it harder for the board to argue that Robert was doing anything wrong. He was running a market in plain sight, without breaking actual laws. This public visibility, however, only enraged the HOA further. Gerald pushed harder, lobbying the county zoning office to intervene, writing letters to city officials, and rallying the few remaining residents who supported his strict vision of neighborhood order. He painted Robert as reckless, disruptive, and disrespectful of community rules. The narrative Gerald pushed was one of chaos and decline, but outside of the HOA chamber, the story spreading through the county was very different. People saw a man standing up against an overreaching board and winning. Robert, though, felt the strain deepening. He had become both the symbol of resistance and the target of obsession. His personal life revolved around defending the market, responding to letters, and strategizing with neighbors. Simple joys, reading in his garden, enjoying a quiet evening, were overshadowed by the constant weight of anticipation. Would there be another fine? Another notice? Another shadow lurking near his mailbox? As December crept closer, Gerald made his boldest move yet. The HOA announced an emergency board meeting, framing it as a gathering to restore order and protect property values. The language was sharp and theatrical, a thin veil for what everyone knew. The board wanted Robert dismantled. Flyers were distributed, emails were sent, and Gerald himself knocked on doors to encourage attendance. It was clear that this meeting would not be routine. It would be an attack staged under the guise of procedure. Robert prepared in silence. He knew he couldn't avoid the meeting, but he also knew walking into it would be like stepping into a lion's den. Still, he reminded himself of the crowds, the laughter, the shared sense of defiance at the market. He wasn't just representing himself anymore. He carried the weight of a movement. That thought steadied him. The night of the meeting, the community hall buzzed with energy. Folding chairs filled the space, the air thick with tension. On one side, Robert's supporters gathered, whispering encouragement and clutching photos of the market as if they were evidence of joy. On the other, Gerald's loyalists sat stiff and silent, their expressions cold. The board sat elevated at the front, papers stacked high, with Gerald in the center, his face tight with determination. The proceedings were relentless. Gerald presented violation after violation, projected photographs onto a screen, and spoke in clipped, official tones. He painted Robert as a danger, accusing him of jeopardizing safety, attracting outsiders, and defying every rule. Each accusation felt like a stone thrown, each fine like a weight added to Robert's back. But then, something shifted. Robert's supporters began to speak, not with outbursts, but with steady, calm testimony. Neighbors described the joy the market had brought, the sense of unity it created, the way it turned strangers into friends. Parents spoke of children playing safely, seniors of feeling connected, local vendors of finding a place to share their crafts. One by one, they reframed the narrative Gerald had built, turning the image of chaos into one of community. The board looked uneasy. Their expressions shifted from confidence to discomfort as the room's energy leaned heavily toward Robert's side. Gerald, however, did not falter. His voice grew louder, his gestures sharper, his accusations harsher. But the more he pushed, the more desperate he seemed. His obsession was on display, and everyone could see it. Robert sat quietly through it all, his expression calm but firm. He didn't need to argue. The community was doing it for him. The very people the HOA claimed to protect had turned into his shield. By the end of the night, it was clear the board hadn't won the room, they had lost it. Still, no official ruling came. The board tabled the decision, retreating into further deliberation. But Robert could sense it, the board was cracking. Their desperation had exposed them. They weren't fighting for the neighborhood anymore, they were fighting for their pride. When Robert walked home that night, the street felt different. Porch lights glowed warmly, neighbors waved with quiet smiles, and the air carried a sense of shared purpose. The HOA hadn't given up, but their grip was slipping. And for the first time in weeks, Robert felt not just like a fighter, but like a man on the verge of victory. Winter had settled firmly over the neighborhood, frosting rooftops and painting the cul-de-sac in shades of silver and gray. Despite the cold, Robert's driveway market continued to thrive, now adorned with twinkling lights, evergreen wreaths, and warm cups of cocoa passed from stall to stall. The scene was more than festive, it was symbolic. The blocked driveway that had once been an inconvenience had transformed into a beacon of defiance and resilience. Families bundled in scarves and mittens gathered weekly, their laughter echoing through the frosted air, while the HOA's presence loomed in the shadows, angrier and more powerless with every passing weekend. Gerald and the board had exhausted nearly every tool in their arsenal. They had levied fines, filed liens, sent inspectors, and called the police. None of it had broken Robert or the community that had grown around him. Each tactic had backfired, fueling the market's popularity and strengthening Robert's role as a folk hero. The harder the HOA fought, the more isolated it became. What once seemed like a governing authority now looked like a petty bureaucracy, out of touch and obsessed. Still, the board refused to yield. In a final desperate move, Gerald announced a lawsuit, claiming Robert's market violated zoning laws and constituted an unauthorized business operation. The news spread quickly, not just through the neighborhood but across the city. Local journalists caught wind of the story, intrigued by the bizarre conflict. A man running a market from his blocked driveway, an HOA waging war against community gatherings, and neighbors caught in the middle. Cameras soon appeared at the end of the street, reporters asking questions, recording footage of the market, and interviewing residents. The lawsuit, intended to intimidate, instead amplified Robert's cause. News outlets ran headlines highlighting the absurdity. HOA declares war on pop-up market, blocked driveway becomes neighborhood festival, and when rules go too far, the HOA battle that sparked a movement. What Gerald had hoped would be the final blow became a megaphone, broadcasting the story to thousands of people far beyond the subdivision. Robert, though weary, held steady. He didn't gloat, didn't lash out, didn't feed the fire with anger. Instead, he kept the market alive, focusing on the simple things: neighbors sharing bread, children sipping cocoa, vendors displaying handmade goods. He knew the cameras would capture more than conflict. They would capture the humanity of what had grown from his defiance. That was the image he wanted the world to see. The lawsuit dragged on, hearings scheduled and delayed, paperwork piling higher than snowdrifts. But each appearance in court only brought more public attention. Protesters began showing up at hearings with signs supporting Robert, chanting about fairness, freedom, and community. Social media amplified the message further, with clips of the market spreading under hashtags that mocked the HOA. What had started as a blocked driveway was now a symbol of resistance against overreach everywhere. For Gerald, the pressure was unbearable. The man who once strutted through the neighborhood with authority now avoided public appearances. His once steady supporters dwindled, some resigning from the board, others quietly distancing themselves. At meetings, attendance dropped, and the few who remained were met with open frustration from residents tired of constant battles. The authority that Gerald had clung to so fiercely was slipping through his fingers. The turning point came during a particularly bitter January evening. The market was in full swing, strings of lights glowing against the snow, when a local news station broadcasted live from the scene. The camera panned over smiling families, neighbors laughing, and stalls buzzing with energy. Then, without warning, Gerald appeared at the edge of the crowd, his face pale, his posture rigid. He had come to make a stand. Storming into the market, Gerald began shouting over the music and chatter, accusing Robert of destroying the neighborhood, of corrupting the spirit of the community, of making a mockery of the rules. His voice cracked with anger, his words spiraling into incoherent rage. The cameras caught every second. But instead of rallying sympathy, Gerald's outburst exposed the truth. Viewers across the city, and soon the country, saw not a man defending order, but a leader consumed by obsession. Neighbors stood frozen, watching him unravel, while Robert remained calm, quietly standing among his supporters. The contrast was striking. One man shouting into the cold night, another surrounded by warmth, laughter, and light. The footage went viral. Within days, Gerald was no longer the face of authority. He was a cautionary tale of what happens when control becomes obsession. The board dissolved under the pressure, resignations piling up until no one was left to enforce the endless rules. The lawsuit, once touted as the HOA's final weapon, was quietly withdrawn. The HOA itself, stripped of leadership and public credibility, ceased to function. Robert's driveway remained blocked, the curb never restored, but what it symbolized had changed forever. The market became a permanent fixture, not because it had to be, but because people wanted it to be. It was no longer just about defiance, it was about community. What started as resistance had grown into tradition, a weekly reminder of what neighbors could build when rules were stripped away and humanity was allowed to breathe. By spring, the market was thriving. Musicians played on weekends, children sold lemonade, families shared homemade meals, and vendors built small businesses that began to flourish beyond the neighborhood. The driveway that had once imprisoned Robert's car had freed an entire community from the invisible chains of overreach. And as the seasons turned, Robert found peace again. Not the quiet solitude he once knew, but a deeper kind of peace, rooted in connection. His home was no longer just a house on a cul-de-sac. It was the heart of a movement, proof that even the strictest rules could be undone by resilience, unity, and a little creativity. The HOA had tried to bury him under fines, liens, and lawsuits. But in the end, it was their pride, their obsession, and their desperation that destroyed them. Robert hadn't just survived the war, he had transformed it into something beautiful. And the glow of the market lights, reflected in the faces of his neighbors, ensured the lesson would never be forgotten. This was today's secret. Every shed hides a secret, but remember, the shed never stays quiet for long. Until next time, Secret Shed Stories.